Week 7, Post-War America. This week we start the Roaring Twenties, a fascinating period when a lot of changes were going on. To give you some idea of the big picture, here's our approach. This week we'll focus on the days when Woodrow Wilson was still in office, although he became very sick and was hardly visible as a leader. America's economy, government, and society had been hyped for war for about 18 months. There were over 1 million American soldiers overseas on Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. During this era, two important amendments to the U.S. Constitution were adopted, ratified, and put into effect. They were the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, and the 19th Amendment, Women's Suffrage. Both amendments were the fruit of long fights by politically active women. It was the Women's Christian Temperance Union that really got the ball rolling to ban alcohol, and then a Seneca Fall Women's Convention that started the drive for a woman's right to vote. Dialectic students will review the entire women's movement this week. After the Great War, Americans tried to get back to everyday life, but there were some major economic bumps before things really settled back down. Prices spiked as businesses tried to get a government-regulated economy back into private hands. It was hard for many people to make ends meet, especially workers. Business leaders wanted to regain their pre-war profits, so they kept workers' salaries low even when prices were rising. During the war, however, workers had tasted the power of collective bargaining, and when they perceived that management wasn't going to work with them, laborers turned to strikes. Because of recent events in Russia and on the European continent, it was easy for Americans to fear that violent socialists were going to take over America. Older students will study the Red Scare this week. Let's start our overview with that. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin overthrew the Russian government in the Revolution of 1917. It took him some time to gain control of his own population, but in March 1919, after World War I had ended, Lenin created a new organization called the Communist International, which was intended to fight, by all available means, including armed force, for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie and for the creation of an international Soviet republic as a transition stage to the complete abolition of the state. Communist international organizations, or Cominterns, sprang up all around the world. Peace-loving people everywhere were terrified that the bloody, forced revolution in Russia could be repeated in their countries. These fears were not completely without cause. There were American labor leaders and liberal intellectuals who believed in socialism. Some advocated government control of mines, railroads, even farms. These were mainstream compared to the hardcore communists and anarchists who, emboldened by Russia's experiences, demanded an immediate, violent, and permanent overthrow of the American government. The radicals made up just a tiny percentage of the American population, but their views were aired publicly and they added momentum to the big Red Scare. Some of these more radical protesters took steps to violence. In 1919, a series of bombs were packaged and mailed to government officials. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer survived an attack on his own home. A radical anarchist blew up his porch while Palmer, his wife, and child were inside. It didn't take anarchists to strike terror into American hearts. An ordinary labor strike unleashed panic on the people of Boston. The problem in this case was that it was the police force that went on strike. When the police went off the job, looting, violence, and vandalism broke out. The governor of Massachusetts, a man named Calvin Coolidge, called out the National Guard to restore order and fired 19 suspended police officers. Coolidge said nobody ever had the right to imperil the public safety through a strike. Business leaders discovered they could win public relations battles by painting ordinary strikers as Bolshevik revolutionaries. Labor leaders didn't let that stop them from striking, though, so tensions escalated. It turned into a national crisis. Attorney General Palmer recruited a young law student named J. Edgar Hoover to help fight the Reds. Palmer used the Sedition Act, a law passed at the height of World War I, to authorize police agents to make warrantless arrests of more than 6,000 suspected communists and communist leaders as they met in halls around the country. It was a time of hysteria. According to our rhetoric level book, only yesterday, college graduates were calling for the dismissal of professors suspected of radicalism. School teachers were being made to sign oaths of allegiance. Businessmen with unorthodox political or economic ideas were learning to hold their tongues if they wanted to hold their jobs. A cloud of suspicion hung in the air, and intolerance became an American virtue. Blind panic is bad for democracies. The Red Scare affected more than just Reds. It made life worse for Jews, Catholics, and Black Americans. It was all too easy to leap from the threat of Marxist revolution to a fear of anything un-American. Since many people thought American meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant capitalism, anything else was suspect. 2 weeks from now, students on the government track will read a Supreme Court case in which the Ku Klux Klan sponsored an initiative petition in Oregon that banned all private schools. The Klan wanted to keep Catholics and, quote, foreigners, close quote, from teaching children any un-American ideas. Many blacks had moved to the North during World War I and now competed in northern cities with returning white veterans for jobs, houses, and other amenities of society. Increased post-war racial oppression caused tensions. When a single incident in the Chicago area touched off 6 days of rioting, looting, and lynching, other cities that had significant black populations also experienced riots or increased incidents of intolerance and the growth of racial tension. Nobody knows how long the Red Scare might have lasted, but Attorney General Palmer, who had helped to fan the flames, ended up by unintentionally helping to put them out. He announced that May Day had been selected by the radicals as the date for a general strike and for assassinations. On May 1st, 1920, nothing happened. Palmer and his fully mobilized police units were left looking very foolish. As the summer of 1920 unfolded, people found that other things successfully competed for their attention. The nominations for the upcoming election, fascinating topics of prohibition and women's suffrage, both newly made law and both just being enforced, and various scandals were much more interesting to talk about. The Red Scare subsided, and Americans moved on to other things. What else was there to talk about? Well, lots. The 18th Amendment gave Congress, and the states, explicit authority to ban alcohol. Congress enacted the Volstead Act, which made it illegal to sell, manufacture, or transport alcoholic beverages anywhere in the United States. President Wilson vetoed the act. He thought prohibiting alcohol would create a nation of lawbreakers, but he was overruled. In hindsight, Wilson turns out to have been absolutely correct on this point. Instead of increasing morality and eradicating the use of alcohol, for many upper and middle class Americans, the 90s became one of the most corrupt and lawless eras in U.S. history. We'll cover this in more detail in Week 10. Many ordinary, law-abiding people rebelled against prohibition. Bathtub gin, homebrewed alcohol, was sold by bootleggers and distributed through local venues such as ice cream parlors and grocery stores. Policemen who had been bribed or given alcohol often disregarded these illegal practices. Although these underhanded, illegal practices seemed trivial at first, they opened the door for mobster violence, more crime, and a serious threat to the rule of law in America. The 18th Amendment wasn't the only big change, though. The 19th Amendment gave American women the right to vote in federal elections. It was a long time coming. Women had been working towards this goal since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was the first public conference regarding women's rights in history. In that year, the same year that Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott drew up a document that they called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, which affirmed that men and women were created equal and listed 18 grievances to bring to the public's attention. The Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions was barely passed at the conference, in part because it included a resolution about a woman's right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was a single woman who grew up in a Quaker home. As a female schoolteacher, she was paid only 1/5 of a male teacher's salary in the same position. She became a friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and grew determined to change the culture of inequality that she had experienced. In 1863, Anthony and Stanton led a group of women to form a petition that asked for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. After the 13th Amendment officially freed the slaves in 1865, Anthony and Stanton formed the American Equal Rights Association to help both freed slaves and women gain the right to vote. In 1875, the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote in federal elections. Many women were thrilled about this, but Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton objected to the 15th Amendment because women weren't included, while other women publicly supported the amendment. That split the growing women's movement for the next 15 years. But the early suffragettes decided to mend fences in 1890 when they realized they weren't getting any younger. They saw they needed to raise up new leaders for the cause. By the early 20th century, the first generation of women's activists was dying off, and new women moved to the front. Many of these had been active in the Populist Party, which held that America needed to fend off the corrupting influences of the big cities with the virtue of the countryside. The Populist Party embraced issues where women were in the forefront, such as temperance. The populists argued that women should be allowed to vote because they were better than men, more civilized, more public-spirited, more virtuous. Although the populists never won a presidential election, many of their ideas made it into the mainstream, especially prohibition and a woman's right to vote. Thus, both the 18th and 19th Amendments owe a debt to the populist movement. Ironically, no sooner had women gained the right to vote, in part because of their superior virtue, than the newly liberated women of the Roaring Twenties set new lows in female behavior. A whole new generation of flappers arose. A flapper was the label for a woman who loved having a good time, was not dependent on men, and was sexually, quote, liberated. A flapper was often seen wearing short skirts, heavy makeup, and bobbed hair. She typically listened to the latest jazz music, danced the latest scandalous dances, drove an automobile, smoked cigarettes, drank prohibited alcohol and illegal speakeasies, and otherwise flouted conventional norms. It was a revolutionary era, a time of temptation all around. In hindsight, it's easy to see where people went wrong, but it was so easy to make a mistake if you lived in such turbulent times, whether one was rich, poor, young, old, liberal, conservative, white, black, male, female, Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. May God teach us how to study other people's mistakes so that we can learn from them without judging them.